I still remember the sound of the doorbell that night because it marked the exact moment my marriage stopped feeling like home. It was almost 11 when I opened the front door and found my husband, Daniel, standing beside his daughter, Madison, and her husband, Ryan. Two oversized suitcases rested on the porch behind them. Before I could even ask what was happening, Madison stepped inside, smiled like she already owned the place, and handed me a neatly written page filled with instructions. Breakfast had to be ready every morning at 6 sharp. No greasy food, fresh sheets every week, bathrooms cleaned every night. Their work clothes washed by hand, ironed carefully, and hung instead of folded. I looked at Daniel, waiting for him to laugh and tell me this was some strange joke. He never said a single word. That silence told me everything. The following morning I woke before dawn and followed every demand exactly as it had been written. At 6 o'clock, breakfast was already waiting on the dining table. Egg whites, fresh fruit, dry wheat toast, and coffee sat neatly arranged while every counter sparkled. The guest room had spotless sheets, the bathroom smelled fresh, and every detail looked perfect. I stood quietly by the kitchen window holding my coffee while listening to footsteps coming down the stairs. I was not serving them because they deserved it. I was watching how comfortable they would become when they believed they had already won. Madison entered first with perfectly styled hair and the confidence of someone convinced the world existed for her convenience. Ryan wandered behind her, rubbing sleep from his eyes. She paused when she saw the breakfast, then smiled with obvious satisfaction instead of gratitude. She congratulated herself for being right about me, telling Ryan she knew I would understand. I simply placed another bowl of fruit beside her plate and reminded her that I had followed the list exactly. She searched my face for sarcasm but found none. Calmness always unsettled selfish people more than anger ever could. Daniel finally walked downstairs looking nervous, almost relieved that no argument had erupted overnight. He greeted everyone cautiously while watching me from the corner of his eye. Madison complimented the breakfast before casually suggesting changes for tomorrow as though she were speaking to hotel staff. Daniel relaxed because everything appeared peaceful. He never realized peace and surrender were completely different things. While everyone ate, I quietly remembered photographing Madison's instruction sheet before hiding the original inside my office desk. Something told me that piece of paper would matter someday. As breakfast ended, Madison announced they needed half the garage for Ryan's equipment and additional pantry space for their groceries. Every sentence began with the same words: Dad said, Dad promised, Dad agreed. Those simple phrases transformed my home into property they believed belonged entirely to Daniel. Every time she spoke those words, my husband lowered his eyes instead of correcting her. That hurt more than any insult Madison could ever invent because I understood he had already made decisions about my home without asking me once. I had known Madison since she was a little girl. After Daniel divorced her mother, I tried to become a steady presence without replacing anyone. I remembered birthdays, attended school events, mailed care packages during college, and always treated her with kindness. I never expected gratitude, only respect. Instead, my consistency had convinced her that I would accept anything. She mistook patience for weakness, and Daniel encouraged that misunderstanding every time he chose silence instead of honesty. Later that afternoon, Madison complained about my towels because they were blue instead of white. Those towels had belonged to my late mother, who had carefully chosen them years before. I smiled politely and told her I would remember her preference. Inside, something became incredibly clear. This was no longer about helping family through a difficult time. They intended to reshape every corner of my life, until I no longer recognized the house where I had spent decades building memories. Driving home from the grocery store that evening, I sat in the parking lot for several minutes, watching strangers live ordinary lives. A father loaded groceries into his trunk, while a young cashier laughed with a coworker outside the entrance. Their worlds continued normally while mine had shifted beneath my feet. When I finally returned home, I heard Madison telling someone over the phone how comfortable it was living in her father's house. I walked past without correcting her because I wanted to know exactly how many times she would repeat that lie before reality finally caught up with her. That night Daniel entered our bedroom and carefully asked whether I was upset. His voice carried the nervous tone of someone hoping for an easy answer. I reminded him that families usually asked before arriving with luggage close to midnight. He defended Madison by saying she had been embarrassed about their financial problems. I answered quietly that embarrassed people usually apologized instead of handing out chore lists. For the first time all day, He looked directly into my eyes before quickly looking away again. That tiny movement shattered something inside me because I realized my husband was choosing comfort over honesty. The next morning I repeated the same routine with perfect precision. Breakfast appeared exactly on time. Bathrooms were spotless. Laundry was neatly organized. I obeyed every request because each completed task revealed something new about the people living under my roof. Madison gradually stopped acting like a guest. She referred to the guest room as her room, called the kitchen her father's kitchen, and parked Ryan wherever they pleased. Instead of arguing, I quietly documented everything, every demand, every assumption, every careless sentence beginning with "Dad said." By the second week, Madison no longer bothered pretending she appreciated anything I did. She expected fresh coffee waiting every morning, special groceries purchased without asking, and every shared space rearranged for her convenience. Meanwhile, Daniel continued avoiding conflict because avoiding conflict was easier than admitting he had betrayed my trust. They believed I had accepted my new role inside my own home. None of them realized that every polite smile, every carefully prepared breakfast, and every silent note I recorded was bringing me one step closer to reclaiming everything they believed they had already taken. A few days later, Madison marched into the kitchen carrying a stack of towels and frowned as though she had uncovered a serious problem. She complained that the towels were old and insisted she preferred bright white ones instead. I calmly told her I would remember that, even though those blue towels had belonged to my mother and carried memories far more valuable than her opinion. Watching her criticize something so personal convinced me that kindness alone would never earn respect from someone who believed everything around her existed for her comfort. The following Monday, she began leaving grocery lists on the counter, expecting me to buy expensive items she never discussed with me directly. When I returned without almond milk and specialty foods, she looked offended, as though I had ignored an order instead of declining an unreasonable demand. Daniel immediately tried smoothing things over, encouraging everyone to keep the peace. I noticed something important during those conversations. Every compromise required something from me while nobody expected Madison or Ryan to change their behavior even slightly. That afternoon I sat inside my small home office, the room that had once belonged to my father. His old wooden desk still stood beneath the window exactly where he had left it years earlier. I opened my laptop and quietly began separating my finances from Danielle's. I redirected my paycheck into my personal account, updated automatic payments, and contacted the attorney who had managed my mother's estate. I explained that 2 long-term occupants had moved into the property without my permission and asked what legal options were available. Pressing the send button felt painful, but it also felt necessary. The attorney's reply arrived only 2 days later. She reminded me that the house had always remained inside my family trust and that Daniel had absolutely no ownership rights despite living there for years. She advised me to document every interaction, avoid accepting rent, and never allow anyone to establish legal residency without written permission. Reading those words brought unexpected relief because they confirmed something I had quietly known all along. My husband had promised something that was never his to give away. Not long afterward, Madison wandered into my office and casually announced that Ryan needed the room for work calls, suggesting I move upstairs instead. I looked at her calmly and simply said no. She seemed genuinely shocked that I had refused. Her confidence quickly turned into irritation as she reminded me it was her father's house. I smiled politely and asked whether she had ever actually seen the deed. For the first time since arriving, uncertainty flickered across her face before she walked away without another word. That evening Daniel confronted me in the laundry room after Madison complained. He insisted they were struggling financially and only needed temporary help. I quietly asked how long he had known they planned to move in. After several uncomfortable seconds, he admitted he had known for weeks. They had been losing their apartment, and instead of discussing it with me honestly, he chose to surprise me late at night because he believed I would eventually accept the situation. Hearing that confession hurt more than the surprise itself because it proved he had trusted my silence more than my partnership. The following week I met with my attorney, Evelyn, who carefully spread every property document across her conference table. My parents' original purchase records, trust papers, insurance documents, and Daniel's own signed acknowledgement confirming he understood the ownership arrangement all rested neatly before us. She explained that although Daniel could not legally give away occupancy rights, we still needed to follow every legal procedure correctly. We would provide written notices, document every refusal, and allow the law to speak instead of emotions. I left her office feeling something I had not experienced since that late-night doorbell rang. I finally felt prepared. When I returned home, I found Madison measuring the living room because she planned to replace my mother's furniture with pieces borrowed from Ryan's family. She spoke as though redecorating had already been approved. I calmly reminded her that guests did not redesign someone else's home. Once again she insisted her father had given permission. Instead of arguing, I repeated the same sentence. Ask him to show you the deed. She laughed nervously, but I noticed she never answered the question. A few days later I placed a neatly organized folder on the breakfast table containing temporary occupancy agreements. They outlined rent, shared expenses, parking rules, cleaning responsibilities, and a clear move-out deadline. Ryan reached toward the papers, but Madison grabbed them first. She loudly declared she would never sign anything before tearing the agreement into pieces right in front of everyone. Daniel whispered her name but made no effort to stop her. I quietly collected the torn pages, scanned them into my computer, and emailed them to Evelyn as additional documentation. My hands remained perfectly steady because I understood that every careless decision they made strengthened my position. The official legal notice arrived the following week. Madison stormed into the kitchen demanding to know why a lawyer had contacted her. I calmly explained that written communication protected everyone by making expectations perfectly clear. Daniel returned home early after receiving frantic phone calls from his daughter. He begged me to stop escalating the situation, but I reminded him that the escalation had started the night he invited people into my home without asking me first. For once he had no answer. Money soon began creating pressure where honesty had failed. Grocery bills doubled, utility costs climbed, and Daniel suddenly realized supporting for adults was far more difficult than making promises on someone else's behalf. I overheard arguments between him and Madison as financial reality slowly replaced entitlement. Ryan even apologized privately for assuming Daniel's permission had been enough. Unlike Madison, he finally understood they had crossed boundaries that should never have been crossed. When the court hearing finally arrived, everything happened quietly. There were no dramatic speeches or emotional outbursts. My attorney simply presented the trust documents, property records, and Daniel's signed acknowledgments. The judge asked one simple question: could Daniel produce any document proving he owned the house? After a painfully long silence, he admitted he could not. I watched Madison turn toward her father in complete disbelief as the truth collapsed around her. She had spent weeks insisting it was his house without ever asking whether he actually owned it. The judge ordered their occupancy terminated and established a deadline for them to leave. A few days later, deputies arrived to enforce the order when they still refused to pack. Ryan quietly carried boxes outside while apologizing for everything that had happened. Madison eventually approached me with tears in her eyes and admitted she never should have handed me that list on the very first night. I accepted her apology because forgiveness and boundaries can exist together. Then I reminded her she still had to leave. Daniel stood alone in the hallway after everyone else had gone. He asked whether our marriage could still be repaired. I answered honestly that I did not know because trust once broken could not be restored with simple words. Love had never been the problem, respect was. He had treated my kindness like an unlimited resource and my silence like permission. That betrayal hurt far more than any insult his daughter ever spoke. Months later, the house became peaceful again. I repainted the guest room, refreshed my father's office, and filled my weekends with friends who respected both my home and my boundaries. Looking back, I realized real revenge was never about making someone suffer. The greatest victory came from calmly protecting what belonged to me and refusing to apologize for it. Kindness should never be mistaken for weakness, and the strongest people are often those who quietly stand their ground until the truth finally speaks louder than anyone else ever could.